The Bastille loomed like a silent sentinel over Paris, its cold stone walls swallowing the last light of day. Within, behind its heavy gates and layers of guards, a new prisoner was led through narrow corridors that smelled faintly of damp straw and rusted iron. He walked slowly, not from hesitation, but because the irons at his wrists and ankles allowed no haste. A black hood concealed most of his face for the journey, but when the hood was removed, what lay beneath was stranger still, an unyielding mask of polished iron. Its features smooth and impassive, its eyes hidden in shadow. The guards avoided looking directly at him. Orders had been clear: do not speak to the prisoner, do not ask his name, and under no circumstances must his face be seen. Only the governor of the prison, Benign d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, received the sealed instructions from Versailles, stamped with the king's own crest. Inside was a single line: treat him well, but keep him under the strictest secrecy. It was not unusual for prisoners of the crown to be held in the Bastille without trial. But secrecy at this level was rare. Most inmates were known by name or crime. This one was not. His records carried no true identity, only a false title and the notation, prisoner of importance. Even his guards did not know what he had done, or whom he had offended, to earn this peculiar fate. Saint-Mars had seen many enemies of the crown, but this case unsettled him. The mask was no theatrical flourish. It fit snugly against the man's face, with hinges near the jaw and small openings for the eyes and mouth. It was padded inside with black velvet to prevent chafing, but it still bore the cold permanence of a cage. It was as if the man's very existence had been reduced to a single rule: he must remain unseen. The prisoner never resisted his captors, but his silence was not the obedience of a broken man. It was deliberate, almost regal. When spoken to, he would incline his head politely but offer no reply. When given food, he would eat quietly, with measured movements, as though mindful that even chewing was an act to be concealed. There was a strange dignity in his bearing, dignity that suggested he had not always been in chains. Outside the Bastille, Paris carried on unaware. The city's noisy markets, its crowded taverns, its winding streets, all went on as they had the day before. But among the political circles of Versailles, whispers had already begun. Someone important had been locked away, hidden from the world. The very absence of information was enough to make the court buzz with speculation. Saint-Mars knew the danger of such rumors. He had been warned that if the prisoner's identity ever became known, it could shake the foundations of the kingdom itself. In an age when royal blood carried both divine right and mortal peril, a face was not merely flesh, it was a claim. And this face, it seemed, could not be allowed to be seen, lest it threaten the Sun King's absolute rule. That first night, the prisoner was placed in a cell on the upper levels, away from other inmates. The small window was barred and faced the inner courtyard, so no prying eyes from outside could catch a glimpse. A guard was posted outside his door at all hours, and Saint-Mars himself inspected the locks before retiring. The prisoner lay on his narrow bed, his head turned toward the wall. The iron mask gleamed faintly in the candlelight. Outside, the city slept, but inside those walls, a secret had just been sealed away, one that would outlive the men who kept it. And the king who ordered it. Dawn seeped slowly into the Bastille. Its pale light filtered through layers of stone and shadow. The guards changed shifts, their boots echoing against the flagstones in the narrow corridors. Outside, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones signaled the waking city. But inside, the air remained heavy with the stale scent of confinement. Saint-Mars walked the upper level with the deliberate pace of a man who had long since learned to measure every step. He paused at the door of the masked prisoner's cell. Through the small barred slot, he saw the figure sitting upright on the bed, the iron mask catching a faint glint of light. The man's posture was impeccable, back straight, hands resting lightly on his knees. "Your breakfast," Saint-Mars said, sliding a tray through the hatch. The prisoner inclined his head in a courteous gesture. Though no words came, the tray held bread still warm from the kitchens, a small wedge of cheese, and a cup of watered wine. The prisoner ate without hurry, his movements controlled, as though dining in a salon rather than a fortress. Saint-Mars had known prisoners to rage, weep, or plead within hours of confinement. This one did none of those things. There was no sign of fear, nor any attempt at defiance, only the calm acceptance of a man accustomed to enduring whatever fate decreed. Yet the governor could not shake the feeling that behind that mask, the prisoner's eyes were always watching, always weighing. By mid-morning, a messenger from Versailles arrived. He carried no written orders, only a verbal reminder that the prisoner's security was of the highest royal priority. The king himself, it was said, had asked for reassurance that the man had not been seen or spoken to by anyone unauthorized. Saint Mars gave his word, though the lack of explanation gnawed at him. In his long career, he had kept the secrets of nobles, spies, and traitors, but never had he been asked to guard a man whose very face was forbidden. Outside the fortress, rumors grew bolder. Some said the masked prisoner was a disgraced general who had crossed the king in war. Others swore he was a nobleman caught in a conspiracy against the throne. There were even whispers, half in jest, half in fear, that he was the king's own twin, hidden away to protect the legitimacy of the crown. The prisoner himself gave no fuel to these tales. In the afternoon, he was permitted to walk the small courtyard under heavy guard. He did so silently, pacing the worn path along the wall, his head turned now and then toward the patch of sky above, but never toward the guards. He seemed neither eager to escape nor resigned to remain, merely present, as though waiting for something only he knew would come. Saint Mars began keeping a private journal of the prisoner's habits. It was not required, but the governor felt compelled to record every detail: when he ate, when he slept, whether he dreamed aloud in the night. He noted that the man's voice had yet to be heard. Not once. It was as if the mask did more than hide his face, it sealed away his identity entirely. That evening, the fortress settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The clank of gates, the low murmur of the guard change, the creak of old wood under the shifting weight of history. In the masked prisoner's cell, the single candle burned low, casting long, sharp shadows on the stone. Saint Mars lingered outside the door, listening. There was no sound but the faint rasp of the prisoner's breathing. Somewhere beyond those walls, in the gilded halls of Versailles, the Sun King dined by candlelight, surrounded by courtiers and music. Here, in the heart of the Bastille, another kind of theater played out, silent, unseen, but no less dangerous. And though Saint Mars could not yet know it, the story of this masked man would one day outlive them both. The first real storm of autumn struck Paris with sudden fury. Rain lashed the stone walls of the Bastille, its wind howling through narrow slits meant for archers long dead. The moat swelled with black water, and inside, torches hissed in the damp air. Saint Mars ordered the outer gates checked twice. A prisoner like this, he told himself, could not be left to the whims of chance, not even the chance of nature. Yet the masked man showed no reaction to the tempest. In his cell, he sat near the far wall, hands folded, as though the storm were some distant play performed for another audience. That night, the sound of the wind reminded Saint Mars of a rumor he had heard from a captain in Pignerol years before. It was said that the masked prisoner, before he wore iron, had been held there under the same man's watch. The details were murky, but the captain hinted that the man's treatment had been unusually courteous for someone accused of grave crimes. No beatings, no chains, no filth, only silence, privacy, and a face never shown. The thought gnawed at him. Courtesy was not an indulgence given to traitors or murderers. It was the mark of someone whose identity, if revealed, could shake more than walls. One of the younger guards, emboldened by curiosity and the storm's noise, whispered through the cell hatch. "Who are you?" he asked in a low, urgent tone. The prisoner did not move. The iron mask glimmered faintly in the candlelight, and the silence stretched until the guard, unnerved, stepped back. Later, Saint Mars learned of the breach in discipline and punished the man with kitchen duty for a month. "Do not speak to him," he told the garrison. "Do not even think of speaking to him. His name is not yours to know." Still, the questions would not rest. Who required such secrecy? If he were a common criminal, why not display him as a warning? Why hide him in shadow, feed him well, and guard his dignity as fiercely as his chains? A week later, a visitor arrived under heavy escort, a pale, thin court official with the king's seal on his cloak. He carried a small packet, sealed with black wax, "This is for the prisoner," he said, handing it to Saint Mars with instructions to ensure it was opened only in his presence. Inside the cell, the prisoner took the packet, opened it carefully, and withdrew a single sheet of parchment. His eyes, barely visible through the mosque's narrow slits, moved over the words without haste. When he finished, he folded the paper neatly, set it upon the table, and looked at Saint Mars for a long moment. Then, without speaking, he tore it into small pieces, letting them fall to the floor like snow. The court official gave no explanation. He merely took the scraps, placed them into a pouch, and left the Bastille before nightfall. In the days that followed, Saint Mars noticed something subtle in the prisoner's demeanor. He was still silent, still restrained, but there was a new weight in his stillness, as though whatever message he had read had confirmed something he had long suspected. Outside, the city returned to its rhythm. Merchants shouted in the streets. Bakers rolled fresh loaves from their ovens, and carriages splashed through the lingering puddles. But within these walls, the masked man's story deepened, its edges growing sharper, its shadows darker. Saint Mars had no choice but to follow his orders. Yet in quiet moments, he wondered if he, too, was becoming part of the mystery, another name in a chain of keepers destined to be remembered only as a footnote in the prisoner's silent legend. Winter set its teeth into Paris early that year. Frost crept up the insides of the Bastille's windows, and the air in the corridors bit at the lungs. The great fortress was built to endure siege, not to offer comfort, but even the guards wrapped their cloaks tighter, their breath fogging the air as they made their rounds. For the masked prisoner, Saint Mars ordered additional blankets and a brazier to keep the chill at bay. Not out of kindness, at least. That is what he told himself, but because cold could weaken a man's body. And a weakened man was harder to keep alive. The king's instructions were clear. The prisoner must be kept healthy. At any cost. Every day followed the same pattern. Bread, meat, and wine were delivered by two guards who entered together. Never one alone. The mask was never removed. When the man spoke, which was rare, it was only in brief, measured phrases, and never about himself. Most days, he said nothing at all. One snowy afternoon, Saint Mars received an unexpected summons from the court. He was to present himself at Versailles within the week. His absence would be brief, but he knew what such a visit meant: an audience with the king or one of his inner circle, likely to renew or tighten the rules surrounding the prisoner. Before he left, Saint Mars entrusted the garrison's command to his most disciplined lieutenant, a man named La Rivière. "Remember," he said, "no one sees his face. If anyone tries, anyone at all, you put a stop to it." La Rivière nodded, grim and loyal. At Versailles, the air was warm and perfumed, the very opposite of the Bastille's damp chill. Saint Mars was ushered into a private chamber where the Minister of War awaited him. The meeting was brief but deliberate. No new orders, no explanations, only a reminder that the prisoner's identity was a matter of state security. "Should he die in your custody," the minister said, "the consequences will be significant." Saint Mars returned to the Bastille with that word echoing in his mind. Significant. It meant much and explained nothing. While he had been gone, La Rivière reported no disturbances. Yet there was one curious detail. The prisoner had requested more ink and parchment than usual. When asked why, he replied only that he was writing down things that must not be forgotten. La Rivière had delivered the supplies without question, but the finished pages were nowhere to be found. Saint Mars confronted the prisoner about this, but the man only tilted his head slightly, the mosque's iron surface dull in the candlelight. "Some words," he said quietly, "are not meant for you." The guard in the corner shifted uncomfortably at the sound of his voice. It was deep, deliberate, and strangely calm, a voice that carried a weight beyond the confines of this cell. That night, Saint Mars ordered a search. The bedding, the walls, the floor, every stone and crevice was examined. Nothing. The prisoner had either hidden the writings so well they would not be found, or he had destroyed them himself. Snow continued to fall outside, covering Paris in white silence. Within the Bastille, the same silence persisted, but it was of a different kind, thicker, heavier, as though the very stones held their breath. And Saint Mars could not shake the feeling that the prisoner was not merely waiting for time to pass, but for something specific, some signal, some moment. It was not the patience of resignation. It was the patience of someone who knew a truth too dangerous to be spoken. Spring came reluctantly to Paris. The thaw revealing cobblestone streets slick with mud and the bitter rot of winter refuse. In the Bastille, the seasons made little difference. The fortress was built to mute the outside world, sunlight, birdsong, and the passage of months were dulled to the point of near non-existence. Saint Mars, however, noticed subtle changes in his prisoner. The man's movements had grown slower, not from weakness, but from an almost ceremonial precision. He spoke even less, but when he did, it was often in fragments that felt like the edges of a much larger picture. One day, during the changing of the guard, a young soldier named Fournier came to Saint Mars with a troubled look. He asked me about the sea. Fournier said, if I'd ever been to the coast, if I'd seen ships from Spain or England. Saint Mars's eyes narrowed. And what did you tell him? That I'd been stationed in Calais once. But nothing more. And his reply? The soldier hesitated. He said, the sea forgets nothing. It only hides what it takes. The words lodged in Saint Mars's mind. They were too deliberate to be idle musings. Later that week, a strange incident broke the routine. The prisoner was in the exercise yard, always alone, always watched, when a shout went up from the parapet. A pigeon had landed near the far corner of the yard. To any other inmate, it might have been nothing. But the masked man knelt slowly, extended his hand, and the bird, remarkably, did not fly away. Before the guards could intervene, he reached beneath its wing and withdrew a small scrap of folded paper. The guards seized it instantly and brought it to Saint Mars. The message was short, written in an unfamiliar cipher. It is ready. Await the moonless night. Saint Mars's blood ran cold. No prisoner should have had contact with the outside world, much less in this manner. He ordered the pigeon killed and the note locked away. The prisoner, when questioned, simply sat back in his chair, mask glinting faintly in the dim light. You think you've stopped something, he said, but you've only delayed it. That night, Saint Mars doubled the guard and ordered the gates barred more tightly than usual. Yet sleep did not come easily. Every creak in the fortress seemed louder. Every gust of wind through the battlements more sinister. Somewhere in the Bastille, a man whose name could not be spoken was waiting for a night without a moon. The Bastille had always been a fortress of stone and silence. But now it carried a new kind of tension, one that even the guards could feel in their bones. Men spoke in lower voices. Footsteps echoed with a touch more haste. And the prisoner's cell was no longer merely watched, it was under siege by suspicion. Saint Mars had the ciphered note locked in his personal chest, though its words continued to unnerve him. Who had sent it, and more importantly, how had it found its way to the prisoner? The Bastille was a labyrinth of gates and keys. Patrolled day and night, no one came or went without his knowledge. And yet, the pigeon had come. That morning, Saint Mars summoned Fournier, the young soldier who had first spoken of the prisoner's strange questions about the sea. You were near the yard yesterday. Saint Mars began. Did you see anyone on the rooftops of the Rue Saint-Antoine? Fournier shook his head. No one, sir. But there was a shadow. A shadow? Yes, against the far tower. Could have been a trick of the sun. Could have been a man. Saint Mars said nothing, though his jaw tightened. The Bastille's walls were high, its towers taller still, but the surrounding city was not without vantage points. Someone with the right skill, the right patience, could send a bird from the rooftops beyond musket range. In the days that followed, the prisoner seemed almost amused by the increased security. He paced his cell like a man measuring a room he'd lived in for years but was seeing anew. When Saint Mars confronted him about the note, the masked man tilted his head, as if considering whether or not to speak. You guard me, the prisoner said at last. But you do not guard the truth. What truth? The one you keep locked away in your own chest, tighter than you keep me. The remark struck deep, though Saint Mars did not show it. It was as if the man knew the captain's mind better than the captain knew his own. On the fourth night after the pigeon's arrival, a storm rolled over Paris. Wind lashed at the Bastille's towers. Rain hammered the slate roofs. And thunder rattled the ancient stone. In the chaos, one of the outer watchmen reported a flare, brief, but unmistakable, on the far bank of the Seine. Saint Mars knew signal fires when he saw them. He ordered the gunners to ready the cannons. Not to fire, but to stand as a warning. The guards doubled their rounds, lanterns swinging through the storm's black curtain. Yet in the prisoner's cell, the masked man sat as if none of it mattered. Lightning flashed through the narrow slit of his window, catching on the iron that covered his face. "They will try," he said softly, almost to himself. "But storms change the plan. And sometimes, they change the players." Saint Mars left the cell with the uneasy feeling that the prisoner was not a pawn in someone else's game. He was the board itself. And everyone else was merely moving upon it. The storm had passed, but it left behind a city that felt waterlogged in more ways than one. Paris dripped from every gutter, its streets slick with runoff. But inside the Bastille, the air was heavier still, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. Saint Mars rose before dawn, his boots striking the stone with sharp intent as he made his rounds. He had not slept well. In his dreams, the masked man's words replayed over and over, "You guard me. But you do not guard the truth." It was not the first time the prisoner had spoken in riddles. But this was different. This was a barb aimed at something Saint Mars could not dismiss, his own ignorance. For years, he had accepted the king's orders without question. But now, the note, the flare, the prisoner's cryptic confidence, all of it gnawed at him. In the prison yard, Fournier waited, eyes shadowed from his own sleepless night. He reported no further sightings of pigeons or signals. But his voice carried a tremor. "Sir, the men are uneasy. They whisper about who he might be. Some think he's a prince. Others, worse." "Worse?" Saint Mars prompted. They say he might be someone the king fears more than any enemy abroad." Saint Mars dismissed him, but the words stayed. It was the problem with fear, it bred faster than rats. And it was harder to kill. By mid-morning, a visitor arrived, an envoy from Versailles. He was pale, perfumed, and dressed in the silks of a man who had never known a day's discomfort. Saint Mars received him in his private chamber. "The king has heard of your incident," the envoy began, folding his delicate hands. "He reminds you of your oath. The man is to be kept in perfect secrecy. No slips, no correspondence, no rumors." Saint Mars kept his tone level. "The matter is contained." The envoy's eyes lingered on him. Good, because if it were not, containment would no longer involve only the prisoner. It was a threat, but wrapped in velvet. That night, Saint Mars decided he needed to know more, if not about the prisoner's identity, then at least about the mind behind the mask. He arranged to take the evening watch himself. Sitting in the corner of the cell by candlelight, the masked man regarded him without a word for hours, the flames flicker glinting against the metal. At last, he spoke. "You wonder if I am dangerous," he said. "I know you are," Saint Mars replied. The man tilted his head. "Danger is not in the man, it is in what he knows. And knowledge, Captain, is a more faithful prisoner than flesh. It does not die when you kill the man. It only waits for another keeper." Saint Mars leaned forward. "And what knowledge do you keep?" The masked man's voice dropped to a near whisper. "The kind that has already killed kings." The candle sputtered as if reacting to the words. Saint Mars felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp stone walls. He had come seeking answers, but left the cell with more shadows than he had entered with. The days after that exchange unfolded with an oppressive slowness, as if the Bastille itself sensed that something had shifted. Saint Mars kept his composure, but the prisoner's words would not leave him. "The kind that has already killed kings." It was a statement too bold to be a bluff, too measured to be madness. If it were true, if this man carried a truth sharp enough to topple a throne, then every guard post, every locked door, every iron clasp was not protection, but a dam holding back a flood. On the third morning, Fournier approached with news. "The masked man has asked for writing materials." Saint Mars did not hesitate. Denied. But that evening, when the food tray was brought to the cell, Saint Mars saw it. The prisoner had traced faint letters into the stale bread with his fingertip. It was only a single word: demain. Tomorrow. The next day, a carriage arrived unannounced. its wheels spitting mud against the prison gate. Inside sat another royal courier. This one far less perfumed than the last. He bore no letter, only a command spoken with clipped authority. The prisoner was to be moved, quietly. Immediately. Destination undisclosed. Saint Mars's jaw tightened. He was captain of the Bastille, yet treated like a custodian who need not know where the valuables were sent. Still, orders were orders. He oversaw preparations with a precision bordering on ritual. 2 guards were handpicked for their silence. The prisoner was chained, not for restraint, but for symbolism. The masked man watched the process without resistance. When the final shackle closed, he said softly, "You think you are moving me, but you are only moving the shadow of what I am." The words landed heavier than any chain. The journey began under a moonless sky. Rain fell in thin, needling streams, turning the road into black glass. The prisoner sat in the covered carriage, Saint Mars opposite him, the metal mask dull in the lamplight. No one spoke for miles. Somewhere near the forest road to Vincennes, the carriage slowed. Through the slit of the canvas, Saint Mars saw figures blocking the path. They were not soldiers, no uniforms, no banners, just dark shapes, unmoving. The driver cursed under his breath, snapping the reins. The figures did not scatter. The lead guard stepped down, hand on his sword. "Who goes there?" No answer, only the sound of rain on leaves. Then, one figure stepped forward and dropped something into the mud, a rolled scrap of parchment sealed in wax. Saint Mars took it, heart-hammering. He knew the seal, though he had seen it only once before. Years ago in Versailles, an emblem not of the king, but of the queen. He looked at the masked man, whose head tilted slightly, as though he had expected this. The figures melted back into the trees without a word. The carriage rolled on. Saint Mars did not open the parchment until they were alone again. Inside, only 2 words were written: "Gardez le vivant." Keep him alive. It was then Saint Mars realized there were forces at work beyond the king's orders. And he was standing in the middle of their quiet war. The rain-slicked road gave way to the cobblestones of Vincennes by dawn, the fortress rising ahead like a blackened tooth against the pale horizon. The king's courier was waiting at the gate, flanked by 2 musketeers whose faces were carved into the same mask of impassivity that Saint Mars wore. No greetings were exchanged, only a curt nod toward the carriage. Saint Mars stepped down first, boots striking the wet stones, then motioned for the masked man to follow. Chains rattled. The prisoner emerged slowly, his iron mask glistening with rain, his posture unbowed despite the weight of it. They led him through a side passage rather than the main hall. Avoiding the gaze of the garrison, the corridors smelled of damp limestone and old fires. Somewhere above, the muffled toll of a morning bell marked the hour. But down here time felt suspended, smothered under layers of stone. The cell chosen for him was small, square, and clean, too clean. Saint Mars thought. The straw was fresh, the table free of dust, the iron ring in the wall polished. It was as though someone had been expecting a guest. The prisoner sat without prompting. His voice, when it came, was almost conversational. "And what am I to call this place?" "Vincennes," Saint Mars said. The prisoner tilted his head. "I know it. Kings have died here." Saint Mars did not answer. Instead, he passed the order of custody to the lieutenant and stepped outside. The Queen's message heavy in his coat pocket. "Keep him alive." The words felt less like a command than a warning. The days at Vincennes passed with an unsettling smoothness. Meals arrived on time. The guards were attentive but not cruel. Yet Saint Mars could feel the invisible tension coiling tighter. The prisoner was treated not as a criminal but as a relic, dangerous, irreplaceable, and meant to be hidden. On the 5th night, Saint Mars awoke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, too soft to be a guard's routine patrol. He rose, hand to his sword, and opened the door just as a cloaked figure slipped past the torchlight. "Stop!" His voice echoed sharply. The figure froze, then slowly turned. It was not a man, but a woman, face shadowed beneath her hood. Her hands were empty, open. "I am not here to harm him," she said, voice low. "I am here to see him." "Impossible," Saint Mars replied. "No one sees him without the king's leave." The woman took a slow step forward. And in that movement St. Mars caught the faint scent of amber and roses, the kind carried only by the court. "You think the king is the only one with a claim to him?" she asked. St. Mars's grip on his sword tightened. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows his name." Those words sent a cold knife through him. No one was supposed to know that. Before he could speak again, the prisoner's voice floated from inside the cell. "Let her in." "Captain." St. Mars's instincts screamed to refuse. But something in the calm authority of that masked voice made him hesitate. The woman stepped past him without waiting for permission. The heavy door shut behind them, leaving St. Mars alone in the hall. Minutes stretched into something longer. Then, muffled through the door, came the sound of a single laugh, not mocking, not bitter, but full of recognition. When the woman emerged, her hood was still drawn, but her hands trembled. She said nothing to St. Mars, only brushed past him toward the shadows of the corridor. Inside, the masked man sat exactly as before, his posture unchanged. St. Mars looked at him. What did she want? The prisoner replied, "She came to remember." St. Mars left without another word, but as he climbed the narrow stairs, he realized something had shifted yet again. The prison no longer felt like the safest place for the man in the mask. It felt like the center of a game whose rules he did not yet understand. By early spring, Vincennes had become a gilded cage. The guards no longer stared too long, and the prisoner no longer asked questions. Yet beneath the surface, St. Mars could feel the quiet hum of conspiracy, an unspoken certainty that the mask was not simply a tool of concealment, but a seal on a secret too dangerous to name. One morning, the king's seal arrived again, this time on an order so brief it seemed careless. Transfer him to the Bastille. Immediately, St. Mars read it twice. The move was unexpected. The Bastille was more public than Vincennes. A fortress at the heart of Paris where whispers traveled faster than walls could contain. But orders were orders. The journey was set for dawn. The prisoner seemed neither surprised nor displeased when told. "Closer to the sun," he said, as though he'd been expecting it. Paris in the early morning was damp and pale, its streets still wrapped in fog. The carriage rattled through the gates of the Bastille, its great towers looming like sentinels from another age. The portcullis groaned shut behind them, sealing the prisoner in a place where even the air felt thick with secrets. The cell prepared for him was deep within the fortress. Stone walls slick with age. A single narrow window no wider than a man's hand. St. Mars oversaw the arrangements personally, new locks, reinforced bolts, a guard rotation without pattern. The Bastille had its own rhythm, and the prisoner slipped into it with unsettling ease. Days bled into nights, marked only by the scrape of a food tray or the echo of footsteps above. Yet even here, the sense of an unseen audience persisted. It began with a note, slipped beneath St. Mars's door in the dead of night. The handwriting was elegant, the words few. "Watch the second tower at moonrise." That night, St. Mars obeyed. He stood in shadow, eyes fixed on the pale slice of moon above the courtyard. At the appointed hour, a lantern flickered twice from the second tower, paused, then flickered again, 3 short bursts, like a coded signal. The next morning, the prisoner greeted him with a single question. "Did you see it?" St. Mars hesitated. "I saw nothing unusual." The masked man tilted his head slightly, as if smiling beneath the iron. "You will." From that night on, the signals continued, sometimes from the tower, sometimes from a distant rooftop across the Seine, always at different hours, always in short bursts. No one in the garrison admitted to seeing them, but St. Mars knew better. One evening, the prisoner requested paper and ink. It was forbidden, but St. Mars allowed it under the pretext of writing a confession for the king. The man wrote swiftly, his gloved hand precise, the quill whispering across the page. When he finished, he folded the paper once, set it on the table, and pushed it toward St. Mars. "Destroy this," he said. St. Mars opened it. There were no words, only a series of dots and lines, arranged in repeating patterns. "It is not for you," the prisoner said quietly, "but you will deliver it." "To whom?" "You'll know." St. Mars left with the paper in his coat, the weight of it disproportionate to its size. For days he waited, uncertain, Until one afternoon a cloaked man brushed past him in the marketplace and whispered. For the tower, Saint Mars didn't see his face. But the moment their hands touched in the brief exchange, he knew the note had reached its destination. When he returned to the Bastille, the prisoner was standing at his window slit, motionless. It's begun, he said. Saint Mars didn't ask what. Somewhere deep inside, he feared the answer. That night, the signals flared again, faster now, more urgent. The Bastille seemed to breathe differently, as though it too sensed the approach of something inevitable. By midsummer, Paris had grown restless. The city was heavy with heat and rumor. Markets buzzed with talk of court intrigues, of the king's health, of strange movements within the Bastille's towers. Most of it was harmless gossip, but some threads felt sharper, as though pulled from the same hidden tapestry Saint Mars had glimpsed only in fragments. The masked prisoner remained the quiet center of it all, untouched by the swelter and the noise. He spent long hours seated at the small wooden table in his cell. The iron mask angled toward the slit of sky as if measuring the daylight. Then one evening, the stillness broke. A messenger arrived from Versailles at the dead of night, escorted by 2 armed riders. His clothing was dusty, his face drawn tight from haste. Saint Mars took the sealed packet in private, lit only by a single candle. The wax bore the imprint of the king's personal cipher. The letter inside was brief, yet it carried a tone Saint Mars had never seen in royal orders before, an edge of fear. The prisoner must not be spoken to of any matters beyond his daily needs. Any sign of visitors, signals, or outside contact must be reported directly to me. The continuation of your service depends upon this. No explanation, no mention of what the king suspected, only that veiled threat at the end, sharp enough to draw blood. The next morning, Saint Mars ordered the guard rotations tightened and doubled the patrols along the inner walls. The prisoner said nothing of the change, he merely watched with that same unnerving stillness, as though marking each guard's step and measuring the space between them. 2 nights later, Saint Mars heard the first sound of defiance. It was faint, a whisper of metal against metal, coming from the prisoner's cell well past midnight. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. Candle held high, the prisoner sat perfectly still at his table, but on the stone floor between them lay a thin strip of metal, no longer than a finger, gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Saint Mars bent to pick it up. A file. Where did you, he began. But the prisoner cut him off, voice low and deliberate. You are searching the wrong walls, Captain. Saint Mars looked to the stone around the window slit. There were no fresh marks, no signs of tampering. And yet, something in the way the prisoner had spoken made his stomach turn cold. The following day, the signals began again, this time not from the towers, but from somewhere beyond the fortress entirely. Short bursts of light across the river at irregular hours. He tried to ignore them, but the prisoner always seemed to know when they appeared. One afternoon, a parchment scrap arrived in the kitchens with the bread delivery. It passed through 3 pairs of hands before reaching Saint Mars, who unrolled it in the privacy of his chambers. A single sentence. The key is not made of iron. That night, the prisoner asked for extra candles. Saint Mars refused. You think darkness will save you, the man said behind the mask. But you forget, it hides more than it reveals. The Bastille seemed to grow smaller after that, the air thicker. Guards whispered of hearing footsteps in corridors that should have been empty, of voices speaking low in the walls. Once, Saint Mars found a playing card wedged between the stones outside the prisoner's cell, an ace of spades, its edges damp from the night air. Whether these were warnings, messages, or games, Saint Mars could not tell. But the pattern was shifting. Whatever had been set in motion was moving closer. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the fortress itself could hold. Autumn's chill swept into Paris with a sting, and the Bastille's stones drank in the cold until it seemed the walls themselves shivered. Fires burned longer in the guardrooms, but the prisoner's cell remained as it always had, bare, dim, and cold enough to numb the fingers. Saint Mars kept his watch as ordered, though he could feel the strain wearing into his bones. Each day brought a new unease. Guards grew restless, their eyes darting toward shadows. Even the wind seemed to whisper, carrying snatches of voices that dissolved as soon as one turned to listen. Then came the incident at the Western Tower. A patrol reported seeing a man in the restricted courtyard after dusk, someone neither garrison nor visitor. By the time St. Mars reached the spot, there was nothing but wet footprints leading toward the outer wall and vanishing into the dark. No sign of a rope, no mark of a ladder, just the faint scent of river water lingering in the air. The prisoner, of course, had not moved, at least, not in the way a man's body moves. But his presence was different, an alertness sharpened to a blade's edge. That evening, St. Mars took his supper alone in the records chamber, going over the ledgers of supplies, deliveries, and maintenance logs. Twice, he found entries that should not have been there, shipments of food slightly over the expected count. Bundles of linen marked, for infirmary use, despite no sick or injured men in the fortress. Someone was feeding a second ledger into the Bastille's life. Hidden in plain sight, he confronted his quartermaster, who swore ignorance and looked genuinely afraid. Fear was a familiar scent now, clinging to every man who served here. Later that night, unable to sleep, St. Mars made his way to the prisoner's cell. The man sat by the wall, the candlelight painting deep shadows under the iron mask. "You know something," St. Mars said quietly. The prisoner tilted his head. "The walls are not your allies. You believe they keep danger out. They do not. They keep danger in." St. Mars felt the old, unwelcome pressure in his chest, a creeping awareness that perhaps the king's orders had not been about guarding the man from the world, but guarding the world from the man. The following week, a message arrived without seal or signature, slipped beneath the door to St. Mars's quarters. 3 words only. "It begins tonight." He doubled the guard, locked every gate, posted men in the watchtowers until their breaths came in white clouds. And still, something slipped through. Just before midnight, the prison bell rang, not in alarm, but in that slow, deliberate rhythm used to mark a change of the hour. Only no hour had passed. The sound carried through the fortress like a summons, and St. Mars knew, without question, that it had not come from his men. In the prisoner's cell, the candle had burned low, its wax pooled and cooling. The masked figure sat exactly where he had been left. But something was wrong. The air was different, the stillness unnatural, as if the very stones were holding their breath. St. Mars stepped closer, and the prisoner spoke, his voice no louder than the whisper of the flame. "They're already inside." The words clung to St. Mars's mind like frost, each syllable chilling him deeper than the night air. "They're already inside." He turned sharply, scanning the corridor beyond the cell. 2 guards stood at their posts, muskets in hand, eyes darting between him and the prisoner. The torchlight trembled, not from the wind, but from the unsteady hands holding it. "Inside where?" St. Mars demanded, though he already sensed the answer. The masked man leaned forward until the iron grill of his face caught the candlelight. "Not the fortress," he said. "You." The words struck harder than any blow. St. Mars felt a flare of irritation, an instinct to dismiss the remark as some prisoner's cryptic attempt at manipulation, but deep down, there was a seed of doubt that had been germinating for months. He dismissed the guards and locked the cell again, taking the key with him. The Bastille was quiet that night. Too quiet. Normally, the old stones groaned and whispered as the wind prowled through their cracks. Tonight, there was only a taut, unnatural silence, like the moment before a glass shatters. In the early hours, the silence broke. A scream rang out from the lower galleries, muffled by thick walls but unmistakably human. St. Mars grabbed a lantern and descended the spiral staircase 2 steps at a time, his boots slamming on the stone. When he reached the lower guardroom, 2 men were kneeling beside a third who lay rigid on the floor. Eyes wide, mouth frozen mid-breath. There was no wound, no blood, yet the man was gone. One of the guards swore he had seen a shadow move across the wall just before the soldier fell. Not a man, not a shape, just an absence, swallowing the torchlight as it passed. St. Mars ordered every corridor searched, but they found nothing except cold air and a faint smell of iron. Like old blood. At dawn, a sealed package arrived from Versailles. No messenger stayed to deliver it. It had simply been left on the drawbridge. The wax bore the king's own cipher. Inside, a letter in a hand St. Mars knew well. Captain, events now move beyond your command. You will maintain the prisoner's confinement with no deviation from prior orders. Any anomaly you witness is to be recorded but not acted upon. Above all, you will not permit the mask to be removed. There was no signature. St. Mars crumpled the page in his fist. The order to not act went against every instinct in his body. Whatever was creeping into the Bastille, it was not a matter for ink and paper. That night, he returned once more to the prisoner's chamber. The masked man was standing, not sitting, his head tilted as if listening to something deep within the walls. "They are not coming for me," the prisoner murmured. "They are coming for what I carry." St. Mars almost asked what, but the sudden sound of boots pounding along the corridor cut him off. A guard burst into view, face pale, breathing hard. "Captain." "Cell block 3. The doors, they opened themselves." Somewhere in the fortress, a heavy iron hinge groaned. And another, and another. The Bastille was waking up. The echo of those groaning hinges traveled through the fortress like the toll of a funeral bell. St. Mars moved swiftly, his boots hammering against the stone floors, each step louder than the last. He didn't bother to count the doors that had opened. He knew the Bastille's layout by heart. Cell block 3 was far from the masked prisoner's chambers. But the way sound moved in these halls, it could be closer than it seemed. When he arrived, the air was cold enough to sting his teeth. The corridor was lined with heavy oak doors, every one standing wide, chains swaying gently as if disturbed moments ago. The cells were empty, though none of these prisoners had been scheduled for release. The straw on the floors was flattened in strange, curved patterns, as if something had coiled and uncoiled upon it. A guard stood frozen halfway down the hall, his musket raised, his eyes darting along the shadows. "Sir, there's no one here," he whispered, though the panic in his voice betrayed him. "No one living, at least." St. Mars pushed past him, scanning each cell. There were scratches on the walls, fresh ones. Claw-like marks etched through the plaster and into the stone beneath. The direction of the marks was wrong. They weren't from something trying to escape. They were from something trying to get in. A muffled clang came from above them. Then another. Then the distant sound of chains snapping. It was spreading. By the time St. Mars returned to the prisoner's chamber, the man in the iron mask was no longer standing at the center of the room. He was at the far wall, one hand resting on the stone as though feeling the heartbeat of the fortress. "They're searching," he said. His voice was lower now, almost reverent. "But they don't know which chamber hides it." St. Mars stepped forward, his hand instinctively brushing the hilt of his sword. "Which chamber hides what?" The masked man turned his head slowly, the iron plates catching the candlelight. "The truth you've been guarding without even knowing it." Before St. Mars could speak, the wall behind the prisoner gave a deep, resonant crack. Dust sifted from the ceiling. Somewhere deep in the fortress, an unlit corridor groaned open, and a rush of cold, stale air swept through the chamber. The prisoner lowered his hand. "It's begun." And then the screaming started again, this time from every level of the Bastille. The screaming had no direction. It came from above, below, from the walls themselves. It rose in waves, echoing down the spiral staircases, clattering against the iron bars, until it became less like voices and more like the wail of some ancient wind finally loosed from its prison. St. Mars drew his sword, but the blade felt almost comically small against that sound. He barked orders, half to steady his men, half to steady himself, but discipline was crumbling. Guards who had stood watch over thieves, killers, and traitors without flinching now recoiled like frightened children. The masked prisoner did not move from the wall. "It's always the same," he murmured, almost to himself. "They arrive in silence. They leave in ruin." A sudden pounding rattled the heavy door to the chamber. Not the frantic hammering of a man's fists, this was heavier. Slower. Boom, boom, boom. Each blow sent tiny vibrations through the floor. The guards positioned themselves in a jagged line, muskets shaking. St. Mars in the center. The pounding stopped. Silence pooled in the air, thick as oil. Then, with a groan like timbers splitting under the weight of the sea, the hinges tore loose. The door toppled inward, smashing the nearest guard against the stone. Through the frame spilled a figure cloaked in darkness, its outline wrong in ways the mind didn't want to register. The only light in the room, the wavering candle, guttered low. In its faint glow, Saint Mars caught the flash of something metallic across the figure's face. Not a mask, chains. The prisoner in the iron mask turned his head slightly, as though studying the intruder. Too soon, he said. The seal wasn't meant to break for another century. Saint Mars lunged forward, swinging his blade in a clean arc. The steel struck, but there was no resistance. No impact. The shadow passed through the weapon like smoke. And yet he felt something cold wrap around his wrist. The candle died. What followed was chaos in the dark, shouts. The crash of overturned furniture. The skitter of boots on stone. And, beneath it all, the low murmur of two voices speaking in a language no one had heard in generations. When the light returned, torches hastily lit in trembling hands, the chamber was empty. No masked prisoner, no intruder, only Saint Mars, alone, his sword lying several feet away. And on the far wall, a message scratched deep into the stone. The mask was never to hide the man. It was to hide the door. The Bastille would whisper of it for decades. But no official record of that night survived. Reports were rewritten, statements corrected. And those few who dared to speak openly were soon transferred to remote outposts, or found dead in the Seine with stones tied at their ankles. The masked prisoner vanished from the ledgers as if he had never existed at all. Yet, in the corners of Paris where history is traded in half-truths and candlelit tavern murmurs, the story lived on. Some claimed the figure who came through the door was no man at all, but a keeper of something older than France, an entity bound by oaths forged before the first stone of the Bastille was laid. Others believed the masked man himself was the jailer, not the prisoner, and that the night's events were not an escape but a release. Saint Mars never spoke of it publicly. In his later years, he walked with a stiffness that had nothing to do with age. His eyes often drawn to doorways and shadows as if expecting them to shift. He died in his bed. The official cause, natural, though the servants swore he clutched a small scrap of iron when they found him. The cell in which the masked man had been kept was sealed shut. The stone wall where the message had been carved was chiseled away and replaced. But the air in that part of the Bastille never felt quite right again. Guards reported hearing footsteps pacing in the night, always pausing just behind the iron door, as if waiting. Centuries later, the Bastille itself would fall, its stones scattered, its cells emptied. But for those who believe in such things, the true prison, the one hidden by the mask, was never destroyed. And somewhere, in a place no map will show, a door still stands, locked, waiting. And perhaps, if the wind is right and you find yourself alone in an unfamiliar corridor, you might hear it too, the slow, patient pounding. Boom, boom, boom. End of script. Sweet dreams. Hoi Chat GPT.